guys. Hello.
Oh, you are? Oh, great, great, great.
I'm here.
We're all here. That's wonderful. Good evening, everyone. And is there a motion to convene the meeting?
I make a motion to convene the meeting.
There's a second.
Second.
Any discussion on the motion? If not, all in favor, please signify.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
The meeting is convened. Thank you. Good evening. Welcome to the April 29th, 2021 meeting of the Ad Hoc Ethics Committee. And first item on the agenda is review of the minutes of the meetings of April 8 and April 15. Is there a motion to approve the minutes as edited and amended for the minutes of April 8th?
I make a motion to approve the April 8th minutes.
Second.
I second.
Any discussion on the motion regarding the minutes of April 8th?
I had a question. Does that include Trustee Natchez's comments? Or no?
Speak up, Brian. I couldn't hear you.
Sorry, does that include Trustee Natchez's comments or no?
No. Before I jumped and said no. Were those the comments that I responded with all those question marks? Is that what you're referring to?
No, I believe Trustee Natchez made some edits to the meeting, and I was wondering if we're going to accept those or not.
I confess to not recalling how those edits affected the minutes. Let's table April 8 for now, and let's consider April 15 instead. Is there a motion to approve the minutes as amended for April 15?
Make the motion.
Is there a second?
I second.
I was wondering if there was something bad to those minutes. Any discussion on the motion? Without discussion, all in favor of approving the minutes of April 15, 2021, please signify by aye or raising your hand.
Aye.
Any
Aye.
opposed? Any opposed? Those minutes are approved. I apologize. I'll go back and look at the April 8 minutes and the suggested comments by Trustee Natchez. We can nonetheless, if there are any comments regarding his suggestions, now would be a good time to discuss that. Are there any comments anyone had about what he commented? I'm going to go back and look at that. So we'll hold off April 8th until for our next meeting.
Oh, thank you.
Did you say something, Brian? I'm sorry.
No, I said thank you.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for bringing that up. We welcome tonight Trustee Winstrup to our meeting. Thank you for joining us. And this is a very open-ended invitation and meeting. We are eager to hear comments from the Board of Trustees and generally from committee members, village employees, and the public at large. So we are very eager and interested in hearing any comments you may have. So I'll just turn it over to you and ask you if you have any comments and suggestions to offer to us regarding revising the Code of Ethics, and feel free to be as expansive or specific as you wish.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm really grateful for this opportunity. Before I start, I just want to say hi to Brian. I don't think I've seen him since the Traffic Commission days years ago when we were on days together. It was great to see
Ended
you.
in 2018.
Yeah, it's great to see you, and I'm really
See you
so
soon.
happy that you're continuing to work for the village. I appreciate it,
Thank you.
as I appreciate all of you. But good to see you, Brian. So,
You too.
I think we all know that the Goldstein matter, really brought to the fore our ethics code and how the process works and how maybe, we could change things and make things a little easier, because it was really a painful experience for everyone involved. I am still a lawyer. I don't practice, but in law school, and then when I practiced law, we talked a lot about ethics. And what I always found very helpful personally was to have someone be a sounding board, because ethical questions, I think, involve gray area necessarily. And just to talk through, well, I feel this way, I can see the argument that way. What if it's different in this little way? What if it's different in that little way? And to just really think out loud and use someone as a sounding board. I think that's how you come to a decision about whether your behavior is ethical, whether you need to recuse yourself, whether you've whether you've transgressed in some way. But I think a sounding board is vital. And I don't think that our ethics board in the past in the recent past has served that function as a real sounding board. I think in theory, perhaps they would or could, but I don't think that has been the way they have functioned. And I wish they would. I wish the village had an ethics board that really served that role. Because at the end of the day, I think the decision of whether to recuse and how to change your behavior or not change your behavior is highly personal, and it comes from this sounding board function and really gathering the views of other people. I think our ethics board has been more inclined to err on the side of, just saying, you should recuse yourself. If there's an appearance, you should recuse. And I don't think that's actually the way. I think it's just more nuanced than that. And so if we have an ethics board that is always inclined to say, hey, if there's an appearance and if you're questioning it, you should recuse. That's an easy answer, but that's not the ethical discussion that I think gets at the meat of ethical dilemmas, or that allows a meaningful back and forth participation that I wish we could have. I know in the past I would call the village attorney or Christy Mason, and I would say, hey, I just need to talk this through with you. Here's what the rules say. Here's what's going on. What do you think? Do you think, I just think that's a healthy discussion. And that's how I wish everyone had that opportunity to talk with people about ethical concerns in that manner. And I think that invites more honest disclosure, more call if there's ever any little thing that pops into your mind. I just think that creates a healthier environment for people to explore ethical dilemmas and to really flesh them out.
Any comments, reactions to that? I have two thoughts, Kelly. One is, and I'm not in any way judging the Goldstein matter. I'm speaking generally in reaction to your comment about the ethics board erring on the side of recusal. There has been a lot of discussion in our meetings about the importance of avoiding the appearance of conflict, and that is a factor in ethics boards and other arbiters in these situations telling office holders it's better if you recuse. So there's that. And the other comment, which I think is more central to the work that the committee is doing, is that the idea of informal guidance and a sounding board is a bit of a hot button, and has been a hot button in our discussions, because there is a concern that one might get guidance from an ethics board or an ethics board member and then hold the ethics board to it when it is not a formal opinion. And I can tell you that the direction the committee is heading in is to make informal opinions prohibited.
Mhm, mhm,
So for that reason,
mhm, mhm.
so I'd like to invite any other member of the committee to weigh in on that. And
Dan?
Dan.
Dan, you took the words from my mouth. I mean, I agree with the trustee that we want to have, a working relationship, and then people should be able to approach, but, we need to just resolve, how does that get to a binding decision, right? So that is the problem. And I think we all agree that we want what the trustee is saying, that there should be somebody who can be approached, we can have discussion, but we've got to put a process in place that allows for that decision to be binding and be reviewed. So
The
I
other
agree
thing,
with you, Dan.
and I agree as well, but the other thing I'd like to add, trustee Weintraub mentioned speaking with Chrissy Mason. When we met with the village attorney, he said his opinions are not binding at all, which is somewhat of a concern if people do reach out to the village attorney. So that's just one more piece of the puzzle.
was he a village
But I
attorney?
mean, I think if his opinions were binding, you wouldn't need an ethics board, right? I mean, if at the end of the day, if I went to the village attorney to ask for guidance on a particular issue, and the attorney gave guidance to me, and I ignored the guidance or took the guidance, theoretically there would be, if I took the guidance from the village attorney, then there would be no need for the ethics board. And if I didn't take the guidance, then theoretically, maybe not in every case, but it's certainly in some cases, then the issue would come before the ethics board. To me, Kelly was describing a situation for herself, not in detail, obviously, of speaking to either the village attorney or somebody in the village attorney's office to get an opinion, informal or not, to bounce an idea off of. And I think that's what that's what the village attorney should be there for.
I mean,
Except the village attorney, I'm sorry, Kelly, the village attorney has also said they don't document any of this.
Well,
And
that's a
they're
different
really here-
that's a different story altogether. That, I mean, that
Yeah,
whether
but he also said that they're here to represent the entity, not individuals. So that could be a conflict, potentially.
not really. If somebody is sitting on a board as a planning board, a zoning board, a board of trustee member, the only way that they have any authority is as a member of that board.
well, here's the thought. In that particular case, when I spoke with Christy, I did recuse. It was, it was a gray area. It was like, but I said, you know what, I'm just going to recuse. And I think, though, that if I had decided not to recuse, I think it would have been appropriate for Christy to say, I think you should talk to the ethics board about this. And in that case, I think, going to them for an opinion of the whole ethics board would have been appropriate and good.
Right.
I just think it
In
sometimes.
reality, go ahead, I'm
Go ahead.
sorry.
No, go ahead. I was done.
I think in reality, the only advice that's really solid that the village attorney at this point can give is see the ethics board. That's the only thing that really is appropriate. Does anybody disagree with that? I mean, the village attorney right now, if he gives advice, certainly not binding. And so he sends somebody off with a false sense of security, for lack of a better term, that they're able to continue. And I think the village attorney, until we structure or make recommendations to structure the rules, village attorney, the only advice they should give is see the village board of ethics. That's
Then
how I
the village attorney isn't really doing their job.
I think he's doing his job, or she's doing their job, by providing only that advice, right? Until we put it or recommend that the board should adopt this. My feeling is this, is that we should have an attorney available for the consultation. We all agree with that, but it should be in the rules that the attorney is to advise the board of any informal advice provided, so that the board could have final sign off, and that should be binding on the attorney, whoever is selected.
There are two things here. The village attorney, their responsibility is to be the chief risk assessment officer, really, for the village. That's their job. That whether they do it on a regular basis or not is different. But the job of the village attorney is to keep the village from getting into legal trouble.
Well, I mean,
If
I'll-
somebody comes to the village attorney and says, I have this problem, they are a licensed attorney in the village in New York State. They have legal obligations, just like we talked about legal obligations previously. They have legal obligations that they have to professional responsibilities that they have to live up to. So they can't say, even though I know the answer, I'm going to push you off to the ethics board.
and in this case, Christy didn't give me advice. She didn't give me an opinion at all. We just talked it through.
My feeling then, who is subordinate to who? Who has the final say? Is it the Board of Ethics or the village attorney? And John, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I just think the process has got to be clear, so that anybody who seeks advice knows that advice is appropriate, it's good, and that the village is going to stand behind it. And right now, potentially we have two different people or two different groups giving advice. I just want to establish a process and move it forward like that. And I
don't think you'd have two different people though giving advice. You'd have people going to the village attorney to bounce an idea off them or to ask an opinion.
What if the board disagrees with the advice or opinion provided by the attorney?
I think that the board.
I think it only becomes an issue if that gets referred to them.
Well, what happens? That person has been sent off as feeling they got good advice from the attorney. And then, to be fair to that individual who sought this opinion or this assistance, the board then could change that direction and say, no, that is inappropriate.
Mike, the board prevails. The ethics board prevails on a question of ethics.
I get that, Dan, but that's not the discussion we're having here. I agree with you. But right now, there is a lot of discussion about having the attorney provide guidance and direction. And so I'm okay with that, but I believe that the attorney should be bound to report any guidance and direction to the board for final sign off.
Oh, I completely agree that I agree that he should refer any of those discussions that he has to the ethics board so they can be informed about them. Whether or not he's referring them as for them to give an opinion is a different story. But I definitely agree that the village attorney should be keeping a record and documenting the conversations that he has and the advice that he gives or she gives.
Do we have any idea what kind of volume of ethics related questions goes to the village attorney? Does anybody know?
He asked Bob Spolzino that question, and I believe we asked him, and I think he did respond.
I don't remember.
I believe so. I can't remember. I'd have to go back in the minutes. It was not an insignificant number.
That's what I was thinking. And I believe I said this after we met with him, that I think, given the volume, it's really up to, and I'm sorry, Nora and Kelly, it's really up to the Board of Trustees, I think, in terms of them determining what the role and responsibility of the village attorney is.
Well, you put your finger on it, Ellen, because the code of ethics can't tell the village attorney what to do.
Right.
Exactly.
But the body to which the village attorney reports can instruct the village attorney, you may or you may not respond to these questions. And if we tell you that you may, this is what you must or must not do regarding making a record
Yep.
of those
And especially
inquiries.
if the volume is high, is that really what we're paying the village attorney to do? When we have a Board of Ethics?
I didn't have the impression it was high. At
Yeah.
the same time, it can be made high if the Board of Trustees takes the position or says it's, now that we have a full-time village attorney, if that happens, call to your heart's content. That has to be addressed by the Board of Trustees.
Yep.
And it's not always clear if you're a village employee or a village board member and you are seeking advice. I don't think it's unreasonable to start with the village attorney. You don't go into that always knowing this is an ethics issue or question. Like, it's not always clear that the question being posed by the person, realizes, but the village attorney can navigate it clearly and indicate when it's appropriate to then say, no, this is bigger than just a simple advisory question. This falls under the ethics committee versus me, and redirect, because you can't say, you don't know if it's going to be an ethics related question. Like, don't go to the village attorney. Like, to John's point, that's what the village attorney, I think it is part of their role to help provide consultation, advice, direction. And on ethics issues, it should be very clear, this needs to go here. I don't know.
Well, I mean, let me just be clear though, because when I spoke to, and I'm just focusing on this one example because I think it does illustrate kind of the differences that, we just kind of went through the rules. We just talked it through. And I said, I think I'm going to recuse. Right. And she was like, okay, now I don't, she can send a letter, and document it. We have this conversation, but I don't know that there's anything for the Board of Ethics to do. I recuse. They're not going to weigh in and say, you shouldn't recuse. It's already done. And I think the reason people turn to the village attorney for these conversations instead of going to the ethics board is sometimes it's something that's on the agenda that night. And you just want to know, hey, let me talk this through. I think I might have a conflict, let me talk this through with you. And I think, and if you err on the side of safety and you recuse, I don't know that there's any role for the Board of Ethics to play at that point.
I agree. If you taking your situation,
Yeah,
you made that decision to recuse, but if you chose not to, I think that's a whole different story.
I agree completely.
Yeah, I think recusal is go no further.
Right.
If the village attorney tells someone, I don't see it as a recusal issue, at that point, the village attorney has to say, that's my view. You cannot be bound by my view. I am nonetheless a bit concerned if at a later time, if the individual does not recuse, the individual says, village attorney said that the village attorney wouldn't recuse, although we did say it wasn't, it can be used to lend weight to a position.
I think if the village attorney does weigh in and says, my advice, it goes beyond the let's talk this through and help you come to a decision. But if they say, here's what I think about it, I think that it's, a non-recusal issue. I think it would be appropriate for the attorney to say, however, this warrants a referral to the ethics board, and you should know that they should weigh in on this.
Right. Any other comments from committee members? Questions? Kelly, were there other aspects of the code that you wanted to discuss with us?
No.
I have a question.
Go.
And please tell me, do you feel more pressure to recuse now following all that's transpired in the last year, when in fact you might not, like, are people on our boards feeling pressure to recuse?
I personally, no.
Okay, good.
No.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Any other questions, comments for Trustee Winstrup? You are welcome to continue to attend the meeting.
Thank you. I wish you luck. I know this is thorny, and I appreciate your work on this. Really.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I know it takes some thoughtful people to be involved, and so I know you all are doing that.
Well, you guys did a great job in appointing the people who I serve with, so I thank you for that.
I'll agree with you completely on that. All right. I wish you all a good night. Thank you. And if you have questions for me, please feel free anytime. Okay.
All
right. Take care. Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Okay. Before we move on to the specific agenda items, I have been giving a great deal of thought to where we go from here. I think I made clear to you all that I think we're closing in on the end of our revision of the sections of the code. And what I sent to you today was a suggestion that we, for a couple of reasons, prepare an interim report of the status of the committee and the committee's work, send it to the Board of Trustees, and indicate to them the direction that the committee is going towards with the various sections. This would serve the purpose of giving the Board of Trustees a heads up where we are on various aspects of the code, the direction we're going in. It would, I think, provoke feedback from them. If they saw something that they felt, one or more of them felt strongly about, they could respond. And it also, since it is an open document and discoverable, would give others a chance to respond to, and would, I think, and also give us the breathing room we need to do the writing phase. I've also had another thought about the writing phase. And I think what I initially laid out, I'm just thinking out loud, I think what I initially laid out was a fairly detailed breakdown of various sections of the report. And I'm wondering whether we really need that, and whether what we might do instead is send to the trustees, here's the code in original as it stands now, and here are the sections as amended, which I think might be easier if we just do a save all changes on our draft, and then we could provide some of the changes will be self-explanatory, some of them will require some annotation, but I think it's an alternative path on the one I originally suggested and is less labor intensive. Go ahead, Ellen.
I was just going to say, in terms of your suggestion about the interim report and now your new suggestion, I think both are good and are report to the board can really include the highlights, kind of like an executive summary.
Yes.
Like what we just discussed with Kelly, we're focusing on who do you go to? We're focusing on whose opinion is binding. We're focusing on training. There are things we've clearly focused on. A lot of what has been a theme throughout all of it is just general tightening up the language. So it's much more clear. So if we were to do your initial suggestion, we would be explaining every sentence in the code, basically.
Right.
So I think your new suggestion is right, with an executive summary to go along with it.
Yeah, and as I said, I'm very happy to write the interim report, send it all around to you for comments. And if we're agreed on on content, once we're agreed on content, send it off to them. Any other comments regarding that? Okay. I would like to, Ellen, how, in light of, I don't think we have a lot more to do, as I mentioned, how do you foresee the RACI matrix now and the role it will play?
I still think it's an appendix. Or maybe it's just something that goes to the board, the village manager. I'm not sure. I think the process maps could be an appendix, because that's a picture of, what roads you should be following. I don't know.
Okay.
I'm open to any thoughts from people.
I sent to you the recommendations and comments on code revision made by Mark Ettinger. We actually have taken up some of his suggestions on our own, and I did not include those in the memo. I asked for comments. I didn't get any comments, which is fine. So my question to you now is, do you have any comments regarding the Ettinger suggestions? For most of them, I said we should leave the section as is. There was one where number 7, where I asked whether there should be multiple disclosure on a transaction, and then there was a comment or suggestion made by Mark, it's number 9, where I thought he made a good suggestion, and I sent to you a proposed language for encompassing the suggestion, and that had to do with the ethics board writing opinions in such a way as to protect the confidentiality, not just of the inquiring party, but of any other party who could potentially be compromised if their identity was disclosed. So I open it up. Any comments, questions regarding those suggestions made by Mark?
I definitely agree with confidentiality on both sides.
I mean, I agree with confidentiality to a limit. I think there needs to be an understanding that it's really not confidential. It's, the issues are specific to each case, and as much as possible, they would be, personal information would be redacted, but
To the degree, possible, like again, it can't be
right.
fully
Can't break the law.
exclusive, right? People ask me, is this conversation confidential? And I'll say yes, with the following caveats, unless you tell me something that's illegal, or that, so you've broken the law. So I think to the fullest
while-
extent possible, and that's the terminology that we'd have to use. All conversations are intended to remain confidential.
But I mean, does confidentiality, hypothetically, somebody's copied on the email, on an email. Like the Board of Ethics has a generic email. Like when I was on the Board of Trustees, we had a generic email that people could send information to, and it automatically got distributed to board members and staff. A limited amount of staff. Should the village be, should we be pointing out to the Board of Trustees, that should be limited to the board members only?
Repeat that. I'm not sure I followed.
It's a correspondence, like,
Correspondence or emails or decisions or board work that is copied to non-sitting members of the ethics board. It's come to my attention that emails that have been sent to the ethics board have been shared with people outside of the ethics board because people were unaware that that other people were on a distribution list.
Sorry, I'm a little foggy on this one. You're saying that someone
Non-Board of Ethics members are getting copied on sometimes documents.
on Board of Ethics business?
I do believe,
Seriously?
yes.
Isn't that a function of the Board of Ethics needing to know that their work is entirely confidential?
I would imagine it would be influential in their decision-making.
Is this the same issue that we're discussing about maintaining confidentiality of giving the board the discretion to maintain confidentiality of more than complainants or inquirers? Or is this another issue?
I believe this is another issue now. It's come to my attention that the mayor is copied on every communication.
From the Board of Ethics or
Yes.
from,
He's copied on
So,
communicate.
yeah, it seems problematic to me.
That, well,
I would kind of like that confirmed. I mean, not that I'm questioning you, John, but I don't know where you've gotten this from.
Can I don't know if we have to have that confirmed. I hear what John's saying. I think that we should, talk about the need for confidentiality and put it right into the code, that matters that come before the board are not to be conveyed to other than the board members unless, the mayor or some other trustee is a liaison. And I don't know if that's the case or not. But, we heard from somebody earlier about the subpoenas and the lack of privacy there, and that was disgusting also. So I would just recommend that we put something specific in there, that any matter that comes before any board member is not to be discussed with anyone other than a board member or the attorney. I don't know how anybody else feels about that, but maybe language like that would prevent some of this from happening.
Yeah. The language has to be specific, it has to say the appointed members of the board only. And the attorney and whatever attorney may be representing them.
You know, John, my only feeling here is that, you know, I'm not sure how the law applies here, right? But I think there should be some wording that says, at least initially, that conversations regarding this should be strictly with amongst the board members only until council determines what is going to be kept private and what's not.
My view is that this is something that before we start writing anything, we need to talk to Yoram Miller and ask him and just put the question to him. To what extent are proceedings confidential? To what extent are communications confidential? Are you communicating with non-board members on board business? And hear them out.
I agree, Dan. And I think we should get council's opinion on this, or somebody to talk to us. But there's two separate things, is, you know, the discussion of board business and what is before the board and who should be entitled to hear it. And then the first part that we opened up with is confidentiality of information. So the way I'm seeing it is there's two different tracks here. I am not certain that we can guarantee anybody confidentiality, right? At least 100%. But at least the stuff that goes to the board, there should be an understanding that anything that's before the board is need to know, so long as you know, it's appropriate with the laws.
Yeah, I would be very concerned if
I mean, I think if a resident is sending an email to the ethics board and it's being copied to the Board of Ethics and non-board of ethics members, I think the resident should know that. I think if a resident brings an issue to the Board of Ethics and the Board of Ethics is copying, you know, non-Board of Ethics members, non-appointed Board of Ethics members, because apparently right now there's some to-do about the mayor believing that he's an ex officio member of every board. So
are you saying if a complainant makes inquiry with the Board of Ethics, the ethics board, and CCs someone, clearly they've waived confidentiality?
absolutely.
If they privately communicate with the ethics board, and the ethics board then makes public or otherwise communicates that inquiry, that's wrong.
Right.
And no public official, one might be deemed an advisor, but no, you're not an ex officio member unless the law says you're an ex officio member.
Well, there's some discussion about that.
Can you be more specific as to who's having that discussion?
Back when I was on the Board of Trustees, Norm Rosenblum claimed to be an ex officio member of every board in an effort to be copied and have information shared with him among the planning board, the zoning board, and the various, you know, boards that had some authority, including the ethics board. I believe we actually got an opinion from an attorney, but apparently now the same issue has arisen with Tom. That he believes he's an ex officio member of every board and should be copied on all the communications.
Well, that you can't invent something like that. The law is pretty clear as to who is, I mean, it literally means by office. And one is not a member of anything unless a statute says you are.
Right. Well, ex officio is a non-voting member.
By virtue of office is what I believe it translates to, but
No, but by virtue of office, ex officio member, the way our laws are set up on every one of these committees, boards, and commissions, There is no vote for the ex officio mayor.
But does the enabling statute that creates the board or committee state that the mayor is an ex officio member of that board or committee?
Not the enabling legislation of the planning board, zoning board, and board of ethics.
Right. So that's, to me, period, full stop.
Right. I agree with you, and that's what the interpretation was
All right.
when I was on the board.
John, if you were raising this and saying that this is a matter that this ad hoc committee should address, then I would like to call Yara Miller and clear this up.
Absolutely, it may be taking place. I don't know that Yoram is still on the committee any longer, is he?
He's the chair.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if he was continuing on.
Yeah, he's the chair.
Okay, so then he would be well aware of whether or not there would be any copies or forwarding of any information.
I'm going to call.
Dan,
Yes.
can I ask, just separate from your own, I mean, our mission, we were tasked with reviewing the ethics and making recommendations. I think more importantly, what do we think about that practice, especially in light of when we're talking about confidentiality? Is this something that should continue, that we would recommend or not recommend, and say that we don't feel the ethics board should have an ex officio member or a liaison or any other term, that their work should be in private to the extent possible?
Mike, I
think that's a reasonable discussion.
Yeah, I don't know that we can, if, I don't want to commit to anything now. I want to find out hear what Yoram has to say. But if we find that there is a public official who deems himself or herself an ex officio member and the enabling statute does not so state, I don't know that the our committee wades into that unless we write into the code, the members shall include that. We could write a confidentiality provision in and make clear that there are no ex officio members of the ethics board.
I agree. We could write it either way. I just don't think that we should be seeking the guidance or advice from the chair of the ethics board on a matter that is either written into the village code or not. And maybe we should turn to the village attorney or some other counsel for that. Right? If we go to the ethics board about this, that person may or may not have an opinion on this. I'd rather somebody provide us an opinion as to the village code and what does the code say.
Before I but I want to talk to him because I want to find out if this is there's an actual situation here.
Right, but Dan, even if so let's say Yoram says, no, he doesn't do that. I think we still need to include something on confidentiality in the code. And I think Jocelyn said it very well, to the extent allowable by law. Or I probably misparaphrased you, Jocelyn, I apologize. But
Right.
to me, it's almost irrelevant what Yoram's doing or not doing. I agree with Mike. We are making recommendations.
All right, if the code does not now provide, let me do
Is this the ethics code? Well, I guess, yeah, for the ethics board, but I mean, this should be applicable to all boards, right? Oh, well, I vote for adding something into the code just to address the issue. And I agree also that we're going to revise the code. We now happen to hear it's going on, but let's focus on incorporating it so it doesn't continue. I think that's my advice. The other question is what area should it go into?
And I also think it's two separate issues, really.
Well, I think what we're hearing is if it's a current, like, do we really need to address the current issue, or do we need to focus and stay focused on the code, incorporate this issue so it's addressed, and then we have something to actually point to say this shouldn't be happening?
Yep.
Right?
I agree.
And it may be other sections of the code that need to get addressed to address other boards and commissions, but
Yeah.
we'll tackle the piece that's in front of us.
Or we might be here at the same time next year.
Right.
Bite your tongue.
Come on, Dan, that was a little funny.
I'm sorry. I was obsessed with trying. I lost the code for a second, and I was trying to get it back. That's all.
It's actually on the email. There's actually an agenda issue on the agenda regarding email distribution lists from last week.
What agenda?
The Village of Mamaroneck Board of Trustees.
And what are they going to be discussing?
The ex officio, I don't know. It doesn't seem like it was readily addressed, but it says I realize that many of the boards and commissions have lists have Tom on them, even if he's not the liaison. I recommend that if any of the Board of Trustee member other than liaison is added to the distribution list, it should be the entire board.
They're aware. It's public, the issue. I mean, John, it sounded initially like you had heard it.
Yeah, I mean, but I was shocked when I heard it, frankly.
Yeah, no, I thought you had heard it on the down low and should be brought up to it, but it sounds like it's more public.
It's definitely a public issue. Yeah.
Oh, it's on the agenda. I assume it's public. Yeah.
And, lots of times people just think, oh, let me copy the person in charge.
Right.
I think they're talking about distribution lists though. So the distribution lists are created by somebody in Village Hall.
Right. I did a word search for confidential. I don't, doesn't look like the hearings there are rules regarding confidentiality of maintaining the confidentiality of communications and the like. I'll give this a look and I'll draft something for, I'll draft an appropriate section unless you object, I would like to just have a conversation with Orrin Miller and ask him his views on this or what the practice is.
No objection.
All right.
No objection.
And what I'm going to do, assuming I can get to this, and I expect I will, is I'm going to send you the proposed draft section in advance. And I would very much like, for purposes of expediting our work, if you have any comments, send them in advance of our meeting so we can save a little time on that. What about the language I sent you regarding, I threw in a clause on advisory opinions to broaden the discretion of the ethics board to preserve confidentiality of parties. Are you all okay with that?
Can you bring that up on the screen?
I knew you'd say that.
Yeah, sorry. I know I read it.
All right.
I think I'm okay with it, but
New share. All right. Hey, I got it. Here it is. What do you
Yeah, I'm
think?
fine.
Yes, no?
I'm fine with this.
Okay.
Ditto.
All right. Hearing no other
I think it's
objection.
fi- I think it's fine. It's good.
All right. Now, how about this one? This is what Mark referred to as the no burying disclosure. The section requires one to disclose a private interest in a transaction under consideration by a village body to the individual supervisor and the village clerk. Should this person also be required to notify the ethics board? Should the code require the clerk to do it? Is it overkill?
Well, I thought, and I should have the racing matrix handy, but I thought that any disclosure becomes part of a public record.
It does, but a lot of other stuff does too. And I think Mark's point is that it's not public enough. He's looking for more of a noisy disclosure.
So on
Right.
the,
So,
okay, on the racy matrix, where we have fill and submit the disclosure form, under the informed column is the immediate supervisor, Board of Ethics, village attorney, and Board of Trustees. So we have that covered in the racy.
I don't think we put it in the code.
Well, I must have gotten that from somewhere, unless I just thought that made sense.
All right, without objection, I'm gonna put it in the code draft.
can I ask a quick question?
Yeah,
Clarifying. So you're disclosing a private interest in a transaction. I don't think that gets at the heart of the matter. What you really want is disclosing a recusal. Right?
Well, all disclosure statements don't result in a recusal of something. As an employee, I'm disclosing I have X interest in ABC,
Yeah, but
which may not result in anything, but I need to disclose it.
But you only need to disclose if the thing is coming before you on your own board. If the village is going to, if the village is going to, put a road in and cut my property in half, and it's going to increase the value of my property, and I'm on the planning board, and that issue comes before me, then I would have to disclose.
Right, but the
If the
general,
village, if the Board of Trustees tomorrow decide that they're gonna put a road in on a property that I have, and it never comes before me, and it's never going to come before me, then, I wouldn't have to disclose anything.
no, but John, the basic part on disclosure statements is the Board of Trustees agrees on who needs to fill out the disclosures,
Right?
whether something's before you or not. And you have to fill out that disclosure form.
You just have to disclose your ownership.
There are more questions on
Okay.
that, right? So
Generally ownership and property ownership. But
But
yeah.
whatever's on that disclosure form.
Okay,
So that's what I'm saying we have covered on the RACI matrix. I fill out that disclosure form because I'm on whatever board or committee, whatever,
right.
whether something's before me or not. Those answers to that disclosure should be given to the Board of Ethics as well, which they are.
Okay,
Because
I
they're
don't think, I
reviewing
don't
the
think that's
completeness.
what's getting at, that Mark Ettinger wasn't getting at that here. I think he was getting at, you know, an issue becomes before a board, comes before a board and somebody has to disclose that they are going to, not disclose, that they are going to recuse from involvement because it's an issue that affects them personally.
And this is the section here. It's now 21.6C.
Right.
And it says that, well, you can read it. And the disclosure must be made to immediate supervisor. And then it says the Board of Ethics shall review such disclosures in a timely manner, but it doesn't say you have to disclose to the Board of Ethics. So what Mark is saying is if the Board of Ethics is going to just review it, it's got to be, you've got to tell the Board of Ethics. Otherwise, there is an inference that the supervisor is reporting it. This way you're saying it goes to both the supervisor and the Board of Ethics.
Yep, so that's a part of the, and yes, we can include that language, but that's really part of an overall process. So when Sally met with us, she said she just reviews it to make sure things are signed, blah, 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 you know, not content, and then she turns it over to the Board of Ethics. So we don't have that spelled out in the code.
I think it needs to be spelled out.
Yep.
Any other discussion on this? Okay. Let me now bring in, I know it's 7:33, but I don't think this is going to take that long. Where are you?
Well, while you're flipping to something else, at our last meeting, I asked people to let me know where they thought we needed to do a process map. Has anybody taken a look?
No, sorry.
Anybody else?
Well, Ellen, so not a traditional process, but how about like a workflow of the proper way for a potential issue to like, just because there's some confusion, does it go to the village attorney? Does it go like, so?
Right. So, did
So-
you look at what I sent out last time?
I did not read it yet, sorry.
Okay, that's all right. So that
Came
was,
directly from you or from Dan?
that was a sample workflow, basically, or a process flow, call it what you want to call it.
Okay, so
Uh,
it includes both of them.
so I forgot which one I did actually. So I was just asking people to go through the code and let me know where else they thought that would be beneficial, because everyone seemed to think that workflow was a good idea to include.
Ellen, it came from you directly or Dan?
I sent it out.
Oh, on April 10th. Got it. Sorry.
That's all right. And you could tell me which process I did if you're opening it up.
Yeah, you did. The clerk treasurer provides a list of positions previously approved to provide disclosure statements. So that
Okay,
then the board looks at which positions need disclosure. So that's the one that's in here.
right. And who you submitted, and the gap in that one was what happens if you don't submit it? What's the time frame?
Right. Yep.
Who chases, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
So it's just, where else in the code do you think this would be beneficial?
so you have the one for, hold on.
That's the only one I've done.
Okay, so my suggestion is we create the right flow, and I know we have some disagreement on this, for how a potential issue should or should not end up with the board, whether it goes to the village attorney or does it. I think we need to kind of talk through the ideal, agree on the ideal, and then the flow of how an issue should be resolved. Like, I think that's a great thing to process, Matt.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
And Ellen, I can help.
Do you happen to have Visio?
I did. I don't know if I have it anymore.
Yeah, I don't have it either.
I can do it as you did. That's an Excel. I can do that.
Well, if it's just this one more, I can certainly do it, but I think we probably need it in other places.
Yeah, I think so too. There was another one that just came to mind. You know, is recusing oneself from an issue enough of an issue? Like, is that something that's worthy of process, or is just something we keep talking about?
And I think it's just something we keep talking about.
Example. Okay, so
I think what we need to map out is more where there are action items, and if it's this, it goes this way. If it's that, it's that, you know.
okay, all right. No, I'm just brainstorming idea, anything that comes to my mind. So.
Does anybody else have any thoughts?
I'll take another look at it, Ellen.
Okay.
I have another offer if it's not too early, Dan. Do you want, just for the 3 pages you popped up, I see like little things that for formatting, if you think it's not too early to do the final formatting, if you want me to give it a once through.
I'm sorry, what's the question?
The 3, you kind of have shown 3 different pages during the course of the hour.
Yeah.
There's some couple little formatting things that I think need, if it's not too early, do you want me to take a look through to format everything, all the changes we've made?
You mean format the code
Well,
sections?
Yeah, like spaces, commas, or
I'd hold
too
off on
early.
that until we're agreed on the
Okay.
how we're going to present it. I wouldn't
All right.
want you to put
When
some.
the time comes, I can do that. I'm a printer.
Okay.
I do a lot of editing.
Okay. Thank you. Let me just move to the agenda notes that I sent to you. I have it up here. I have inserted a statute of limitations and provided for 6 years. And in accordance with what I thought was roughly comparable to the New York State civil practice laws and rules. And I compared it to the section that says that 6 years applies to an action for which no limitation is specifically prescribed by law. And I thought that applied to the Code of Ethics. However, I limited the application of the code to disciplinary actions and penalties because I believe the Board of Ethics or the Ethics Board should still be able to conduct some kind of a fact-finding hearing if it chooses to do so, but it would not penalize those. There would be no repercussions, so to speak, in terms of penalties against individuals who were singled out or targeted, and that a statute of limitations would apply. And I think that conforms with law. I have put the section 25 and 26 in the right order. And I'm going to leave the rest of this for, it looks like we will have a basis for another meeting next week. I think that we could possibly wrap up next week, maybe not, given that I'm going to be writing a section on confidentiality, but perhaps no later than two more meetings. Any other items that we should discuss this evening?
No, but I will ask again for people to take a look and let me know what processes they want mapped out.
I'll take a look
Thank you.
before the next meeting.
Thank you, John.
As will I.
Thank you, Jocelyn.
Okay, any other matters we need to discuss? If not, is there a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
Second,
Second,
any discussion on the motion? If not, all in favor, please signify.
aye.
Aye.
Great.
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you all. And we'll confer by email during the course of the week.
Okay,
Thank
great.
Thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Right.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
I know.